Growing up Cuban-American meant that we had rice and beans in our house. That was a staple of Cuban cuisine. But I've recently been thinking about diet culture here in the US and how at one point, and maybe this is still the case, rice and beans were highly demonized and they weren't considered healthy foods. And now what was considered a healthy food or healthy food options were salad or more light meals. So that got me thinking, why don't I ask ChatGPT if I'm crazy? Did that happen? What does that mean? When did this start happening? And let's talk about what ChatGPT had to say, because I grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s when diet culture was literally being pushed down your throat every 5 seconds. Okay. The whole low fat was like really big during the early 2000s. So I'm like, okay, ChatGPT, I remember, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember there being a really big push on rice and beans not being healthy, which is a really big part of Latin culture and Latin cuisine. What is this? Tell me, let's do some research and then let's talk about it together and let me know if this was also your experience. Maybe it wasn't, but maybe it was. So let's talk about it. So according to ChatGPT, starting in the 1970s to 2000s, American diet trends began targeting carbohydrates. Rice and beans or carbohydrates. Major influences included the low-carb diets called, like the Dr. Atkins diet, I remember that one, and the South Beach diet. I remember buying South Beach diet, like pre-prepared meals. So yeah, that's crazy. So these diets push the idea that carbs equal weight gain and protein and fat equals weight loss. But like we talked about, rice and beans are really high in carbohydrates. So that means we got to get rid of that, because that means weight gain. Now, nutrition advice centered white American foods. That does not include white rice and black beans. Let's be honest here. So another layer is the cultural bias in nutrition standards. So for traditional U.S. healthy meals, you think of grilled chicken, steamed broccoli, salad, brown rice, and quinoa. That would have been later down because that is a carb. But foods common in Latino, Caribbean, African, and Asian diets are white rice, black beans, platanito, tortillas. And those foods were framed as too starchy or heavy and not healthy. But if you start digging into white rice and black beans, there is these foods, like everything in life, I'd say. This is my personal opinion. I think that there are some foods that we shouldn't partake in, some ingredients that you shouldn't. For me, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say you shouldn't, but for me, I'm like, that doesn't really add to my diet. There's no nutrition in there, but that's not the case when it comes to white rice and black beans. Like, there's nutritional value to those two staples. So what else? Rice and beans are actually nutritionally powerful, like I was just mentioning to you guys. They're high fiber, plant protein. It's a slow digesting carb, affordable, and gut healthy. Now I'm wondering if ChatGPT, now that we just said that it's actually budget friendly, if there is some kind of socioeconomic factor into why rice and black beans would be labeled, as well as it's not part of a typical American diet. I also wonder if there's a socioeconomic factor as to maybe that's not healthy, we're gonna go into leafy greens. So there's a class bias played a role in this, according to ChatGPT, right? And I think that this is a time for you to watch this video and think about what I'm saying and what makes sense to you. Think about your own experiences. Maybe you didn't experience this. Maybe you did. I for sure did. My sister for sure did. And any other Hispanic person that I grew up with who isn't Cuban, I know that they've also had this experience. So think about this. So class bias also played a role. So rice and beans were also sometimes labeled unhealthy because they were seen as poor people food. In U.S. wellness culture, foods associated with wealth were elevated: salmon, avocado, quinoa, almond flour, while foods associated with working class or immigrant communities were framed as cheap carbs and fattening. Now, isn't that interesting? And it's funny because I'm kind of what you would call an almond mom, or an almond sister, but I'm not as strict as I used to be. And I've changed a lot of my mindset. Like, to me, healthy foods were, like it says here, salmon, avocado, quinoa, almond flour. But these are a lot more expensive things. They're not as accessible for people, while as rice and beans are. And they are nutritionally dense. But isn't it interesting that it isn't just, hey, this is not a typical part of American diet. It's also, hey, we associate these foods with immigrants, with people of a lower working class, so that's not healthy. It's always so interesting how most things always tie back to socioeconomic, right? Socioeconomics, there's always some kind of tie. And to end this video, and ChatGPT summed it up really nicely, the narrative is now shifting. Like, we've seen a bigger push on Mediterranean diets, right? Feta cheese, the salmon, which we already mentioned, but so many other ingredients that might have not been considered healthy for a typical American diet. We're seeing more traditional Latin American diets and more traditional African heritage diets as well. And it's amazing to see how a lot of our Latino foods, it doesn't matter where you are from in Latin America, and of course, every flavor of Hispanic, right? Because I'm Cuban, but maybe someone who's watching this is Puerto Rican, Venezolano, Colombiano, lo que sea, that a lot of our foods have ties to Africa, right? And then those foods were also demonized. And it's really nice to see, and I'm seeing this push on social media as well, the push that I'm seeing is that when you are now maybe like me, if I'm wanting to look for a nutrition coach, I'm actually going to look for somebody that knows about Latino foods, traditional Latino platos para mí, but I'm looking for something more specific like Caribbean and teaching me how can I eat these foods in moderation, right? I don't want to be over consuming calories. And also, how can I cook this in a more healthy way? Instead of saying, yeah, platanitos maduro, out. Arroz y frijoles, out. That's not healthy. What you're going to eat, Natalie, is a kale salad with some salmon. No, that's fine. I don't have a problem eating that. It's a lot of the foods that I grew up, like I ate a lot of those foods growing up because I was a really big part of wellness culture here in the US, but I also want to incorporate traditional meals and traditional ingredients from my parents' diet, my grandparents' diet. And I didn't have that growing up because I grew up in a very just truly a very white American place. The school I went to, the neighborhoods I lived in, and now living here in Miami, I've just discovered a lot of meals and ingredients in Latin food that I had never tried because I didn't grow up in a place that's primarily Hispanic and primarily Cuban. And I want to consume those foods, of course, in moderation and cooking them in a healthier way. Because I can't deny that a lot of Cuban bakery goods, it's very fattening. You know, it's got a lot of salt, a lot of sugar. So maybe consuming them, but in a healthier way. But I just got to thinking today while I was eating my food, I made some noodles. And I was thinking to myself, isn't it interesting that at one point I wouldn't even touch rice and beans? I was like, no, that's not healthy. I'm not going to eat that. No. I want the salad with the salmon. That's what I would cook for myself. And then to see this transition where now I do consume a lot more Latin foods, a lot more typical Cuban meals in my own home, and I cook that for myself. Whereas before I would have completely demonized it, and I was completely demonizing those foods. You know, why would I touch that? I'm trying to be healthy here. Like, what are you guys doing? Trying to get me to eat rice, beans, platanitos maduro, or a banana? No, we don't eat that. That's not healthy. And I've seen a shift. Like, if I were to hire a nutritionist, I would hire one that's Latina. I would be looking for someone who's primarily first gen, who's going to understand like a mix of typical American foods, and then typical Latina, Caribbean, Cuban foods, and then teaching me how to prepare this in a more healthy way instead of the standard that existed for so long, where it's like, if you want to lose weight and you want to be healthy, there's only one way. And the correct way is this typical meal and ingredients from American wellness culture. So anything that has to do with Latin culture and those typical foods, you have to remove them because that's not healthy. And you said you wanted to be healthy now, and you're paying me, and this is what you're going to do. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that anymore. And I love that we're seeing more representation for Latino, Hispanic, and then, of course, choose your flavor of Latino or Hispanic for yourself. And you can find that now online. You don't have to go to a typical a nutritionist that's been trained just for American foods. So I guess this is my little rant. Let me know if you had the same experience growing up here in the US as a first gen. I'm first gen Cuban-American, and I'm gonna be posting more videos. I made a challenge. I'm challenging myself to create 30 long form content videos and posting them for 30 days consecutively, a video up every single day. And I'm just gonna really focus on the first gen experience. Whether good or bad, neutral, just sharing my experiences growing up here in the US, living in a very, white American area, and now living in a very, living in Miami, where I'm surrounded by Latino, Hispano, y mayormente Cubano. So don't forget to subscribe, comment down below, and we'll be talking.